Hi, Tim.
Good morning, Byron.
I am Byron York with the Washington Examiner, and you are?
I am Timothy Noah, and I am a senior writer with Slate Magazine.
Well, we're talking on the morning after all of these mini Super Tuesday primaries and other elections in Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Arkansas, and elsewhere. So I guess the big news is the political death of Senator Arlen Specter. And
yes, before we get to that, I'd like to lodge a protest. I don't know how this got labeled. I think Super Tuesday ain't what it used to be.
Well, you're right. It's not a whole lot.
It's a moderately interesting Tuesday.
In my mild defense, I think I called it a mini Super Tuesday, but maybe a mini.
Right, but it's gotten labeled Super Tuesday. Sort of election days are always on Tuesday, and so I think there's a cheapening of the currency, which is going to cause, in the next presidential election, it's going to cause all of the states to have all of their primaries on the same day in order to secure the title.
So they too can be super. Although, okay, your protest is noted. And now we can get on to the obituary of Arlen Specter. There was John Miller in National Review wrote a profile of Specter a few years ago, and he quoted an unnamed aide on Capitol Hill. He said, there's only two kinds of senators in Washington. There are Republicans who don't like Arlen Specter, and there are Democrats who don't like Arlen Specter.
He is not a greatly loved man.
No, he's not. But I'll say a couple of things in praise of Arlen Specter. I mean, one, he was a very, very smart guy, an astonishing career. I think he was the general counsel of the Warren Commission.
He was, yeah.
And basically responsible for the magic bullet theory. And then from there, he goes on to a long political career in Pennsylvania and in Washington. Exceptionally smart, exceptionally tough. In his mid-70s, he had cancer and chemotherapy and was taking the train from Philadelphia to Washington every day. Most 75-year-old men are probably not up for that. So an extraordinarily tough guy. As a Republican, he ran the John Roberts and Sam Alito hearings as chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He ran them exceptionally well, didn't put up with a lot of guff from the other side, and he had in one case he had a 55-seat Republican majority, so he's going to win. But
I don't recall there was a lot of guff from the other side.
Well, they were trying. Believe me, if the Democrats had their way, we'd still be talking about the concerned alumni of Princeton. But 55 votes will take it. God knows that 59 will today. Anyway, so Specter was very tough, very able, and he had everything you need to be a great political leader except principles. And
right.
I think what got him in the end, that extremely effective Joe Sestak commercial about him, what got him was that his party switch was nakedly political. It was
right, and
devoid
he
of
said
any
so.
principle.
He said, I changed parties because it was the only way I could get elected. I forget, what's the precise quote that was in the commercial?
He did, yes, and he said it get real. He said it in a particularly irritating way, so it made the commercial very effective. And maybe he made the mistake of being a little too honest about his lack of principles. But what happened was Republicans had hated him for a long time.
And Democrats have never forgiven him for tormenting Anita
Hill. And Democrats were saying,
no, I was trying to remember exactly how he tormented Democrat? Anita Hill. Was he threatening her with perjury?
That's a great question. As I remember,
somebody did. I thought it was Specter, but I can't remember.
He had been a prosecutor, and he took a very prosecutorial tone with her about her allegations. And I mean, she was kind of a limp dish rag at the end of her appearance in front of Specter. So he was rough on her. So he's rough on a woman in a very public setting. But I think in today's politics, Democrats in Pennsylvania said, well, why don't we have a real Democrat? This guy has been a Republican for 35 years, now says he's a Democrat for openly political reasons, and we're Democrats, so why don't we just elect a real Democrat? And that's what happened.
Now the question is, why didn't this occur to people in Pennsylvania 25 years ago?
When he was running as a Republican?
Yeah.
Well, he barely survived the Pat Toomey challenge in 2004. I believe it was 1%, wasn't it, in the Republican primary? So Republicans had, they've been frustrated with him for a long time, and they had challenged him. And Pat Toomey, who's going to be the Republican candidate this time, running against Joe Sestak, ran against him. The Club for Growth, has always pushed hard against Specter. They almost knocked him out. National Review, the conservative establishment, was, other than George W. Bush and Karl Rove, was very strong against Specter back then. But he managed to survive and get the approval of the White House, just as he got a soundbite from Barack Obama saying that he loved Arlen Specter.
Now, this is also, I guess, the larger question of sort of why they Pennsylvania voters returned. They almost didn't, but they did return him to office time after time. And this speaks to the larger sort of issue of the political weirdness of Pennsylvania, a state that can't make up its mind whether it's part of the East Coast or the Midwest.
Well, because it's both. It's a long darn way from one side to the other. And Western Pennsylvania, it really is different. Everybody was talking on Tuesday about, oh my goodness, it's raining in Philadelphia, and somehow this great machine turnout for Arlen Specter is not going to happen. But I don't think any of the process stuff, I don't think any of the physical circumstance stuff was as important as the simple fact that he had just come to the end of his run, not only with Republicans, but also with Democrats. Remember, two kind of senators in Washington.
Right. And we don't know how Specter did in Philadelphia yet, do we?
No, I don't. As a matter of fact, I'm speaking this morning without a huge amount of information as to the particulars.
As am I, but I'd be curious to know sort of what the machine actually did for Specter in Philadelphia.
Turned out for him. I believe he had been touting an Ed Rendell appearance late in the campaign. And Rendell didn't day before yesterday, and Rendell didn't show up. And of course, Obama famously didn't come after trying to elect Creed Deeds and Martha Coakley and John Corzine.
Right.
So he didn't show up. So I mean,
smart move on his part.
Well, there was a surge of polls. I mean, you saw him, the surge of polls
Yep.
for Sestak in the last week or so. And at the time when Obama might have swooped in a rescue effort, they just thought better of it. Also, we should point out that Specter is 80 years old, and even though
there's something a little pathetic about a man who would change parties at the age of 80 just so he could hang on to his job.
I know, and it's of course that's middle age in the Senate, but I think voters, I think that was a factor in the Robert Bennett thing in Utah. Robert Bennett, I believe, is 78 years old. I think that there was a feeling among some voters that they could also just get somebody newer, younger, and more vigorous in there. Now the race that I think has maybe more import that I'm still working to figure out is this Pennsylvania 12 race.
Right.
In which
you could argue, and I think I would argue that was the most, even though more attention was paid to the Senate primary, the Pennsylvania 12 was the most important race yesterday. It certainly was the race that drew the greatest amount of effort and money from the parties. It was the most hotly contested of all of these races.
Yeah, that is the White House spin on this, that the Pennsylvania 12 was the most important, because that's the one they won. So, of course,
what's the counter-argument?
Well, I think the death of Specter is a big story. I think the triumph of Rand Paul, which we'll talk about later, is a big story. And I think the near-death experience of Blanche Lincoln are all big stories. So I don't think that the 12 is necessarily the biggest story. However, amid all of this talk about a Republican wave election coming up, some of it done by me, this is a warning sign. And the Washington Examiner did an editorial the other day. I believe the headline was "Don't Get Cocky Republicans," because a lot of Republicans are talking about, no, it won't be 40 seats, it'll be 50 or 60 or 70 seats that Republicans will win. Well, here you have a case in which Republicans did try very hard to win this seat. The seat that was Jack Murtha's before he died, and they lose. Now, Mark Critz.
Now, I will use this occasion to claim prescience, because in my last Blogging Heads appearance, I raised the question, and in fact I thought it was such a great question that I ended up turning it into a piece for Slate. The question was, if Democrats are in big trouble in November, how come it's Republicans who are freaking out? Stated more straightforwardly, the question is the Tea Party a bigger threat to the Republicans than it is to the Democrats? And I think yesterday's admittedly scattershot findings would seem to support my hypothesis. The Tea Party does seem to be doing more damage to establishment Republicans than it's doing to Democratic candidates.
What's your argument beyond Pennsylvania 12?
Pennsylvania 12, obviously, the Tea Party are lost. In Kentucky, the Tea Party candidate Rand Paul stomped the establishment Republican candidate Trey Grayson, Secretary of State, who's endorsed by Mitch McConnell, and Dick Cheney. Voters actually said, "We don't care that Dick Cheney endorsed you. You're just not crazy enough. We need Rand Paul." And you had, a week or two ago, you had Bennett knocked out by a Tea Partier in Utah.
Would you say
so far the evidence is we're seeing Tea Partiers doing damage to Republicans. We're not seeing them do damage to Democrats, except this past January, obviously, in the Massachusetts race.
Would you say that the message of the Pennsylvania Democratic Senate race was Democratic voters were saying to Arlen Specter, we don't care if Barack Obama has endorsed you. You're just not crazy enough, and so we're going to get Joe Sestak. Would you characterize the Pennsylvania race that way?
No, they were saying you're just not Democratic enough. You've only been a Democrat for 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. We don't really buy you as an establishment Democrat.
Mm-hmm. But in Kentucky, the message was to Trey Grayson, you're just not crazy enough. We're going to get Rand Paul.
You're just not a Tea Party kind of guy.
No, you said crazy enough.
Crazy enough, yes,
right.
Not crazy enough.
Mm-hmm.
I will stand by crazy enough. I think Tea Partiers are a little crazy.
Anyway, the Mark Kritz thing. We have to remember that Mark Kritz, I believe, is pro-life, pro-gun. Said he would have voted against health care reform and is against cap and trade.
Right. I'm not stating that this was a great ideological victory for the Democrats.
Well, it could show the path to victory.
It was a pretty good partisan victory.
Well, it could show the path to victory for some Democrats, which is to run like hell from Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi. So
in deeply conservative districts like Pennsylvania 12,
right.
Yes. Now, the larger context for all this discussion, of course, is that this whole notion of an outsider candidate is a little artificial. To call Rand Paul an outsider is a bit of a stretch when you consider the fact that he derived enormous benefit from the fact that his father is Ron Paul, and Joe Sestak, is he's a member of Congress, a fairly recent member of Congress, but even so. None of these guys is a true renegade. So it's all relative.
Well, I would attach.
Would you agree with that caveat?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Actually, the thing I would say about Pennsylvania 12 is that it was important as in the context of yesterday or Tuesday because it was a Republican running against a Democrat. So we got a head-to-head fight there where these others were intra-party fights. Now, the Rand Paul thing, Mitch McConnell, who has had to back away from the fact that he backed the loser here, said on Sunday, as his loss was going to be pretty obvious, said that he felt Kentuckians would be in a pretty Republican mood come November. And it does seem to me that that's a big deal when considering these primaries, saying, oh my goodness, the Republican establishment backed Trey Grayson and Rand Paul just trounced him, and this is the victory of the Tea Party, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The question is...
But do we know what a poll say? I mean, the one poll I did see in today's paper said that 43% of Grayson voters said they won't vote for Paul in the general.
Well, that's entirely possible that there is such a poll. Generally,
it's election day, obviously.
Yeah, as you know, they tend to, when it's one party versus the other, people tend to pick sides, and so the real question will be, will Kentucky elect a Republican to succeed Jim Bunning in the Senate? My guess is they probably will. So, by the way, I think this talk about civil wars inside the parties is greatly exaggerated. I don't like these stories about civil wars inside the Republican Party don't strike me as very convincing. And
why not?
Well, because I think they're primary elections. I think if the people who design
incumbents are historically pretty safe. Why isn't it striking that they are no longer safe?
Then why do we have primary elections? Arlen Specter wasn't safe. Robert Bennett wasn't safe. Every now and then, big, long-time incumbents get knocked off in primary elections, which the people who designed the political systems in the various states foresaw, because there are primary elections.
I'm not saying primaries are wrong, but but usually when an incumbent is in the primary, the incumbent wins. So if we're seeing a trend where the incumbent isn't winning in the primary, that's unusual. That's a story.
Well, how big a trend would you say it is?
Well, we don't have a lot of data points, but we have Bennett, who didn't lose in a primary, but he lost in the party convention.
He didn't even get there. Yes.
And you've got Specter losing the primary. You've got Blanche Lincoln almost losing the primary. She may lose in the runoff. So clearly, it's tough times for incumbents, but it seems it seems to me that to the extent that the Tea Party is a factor, the Tea Partiers thus far are doing more damage to Republicans than Democrats.
Well, let me ask you this,
which is logical, because Tea Partiers, I think, do tend to be conservatives and
not tend to be. I mean, they're just almost all. I mean,
right.
I've been to a bunch of Tea Party events. Exactly.
Sorry, I meant to say Republicans. And so, they weren't going to vote for Democrats anyway.
There you go. I've been to a bunch of Tea Party events, and they're very critical Republicans. They're sort of liberated to be critical of George W. Bush now that he's no longer in office, and they can, they're very upset about spending, and they say, well, Bush just opened the door for Obama to come in and spend all this money. But the fact is, most of them are going to vote Republican, and the key for Republican politicians, and I've spoken to them in interviews about this, is when approaching the Tea Party people in your state or your district, you have to be very respectful. You have to listen to their concerns, and you have to allow them to feel that they're extremely independent.
That sounds awfully condescending.
Knowing, in fact, that they are going to end up voting for Republicans in the end. Now, if they choose, if they believe that they are being manipulated, or if Republican politicians are indeed condescending to them, maybe they won't vote at all, and that could be a huge problem for Republicans. But the idea of any of them voting, or many, voting for someone backed by President Obama, or Nancy Pelosi, or Harry Reid is very remote. So,
right, but that's good news for Democrats, not bad, because it means that they don't, they're not losing, they're not making incursions into the Democratic constituency.
No, the bad news for Democrats,
some incursions into the independent constituency.
Exactly. The bad news for Democrats is the non-Tea Party independents are falling away from them. That's
how many? Right, but how many Tea Party independents are there? I mean, I
think most of them are Republicans, or some of them are libertarians. Maybe they voted for the libertarian. There's often a libertarian candidate in primaries.
It's difficult to have. Yeah, it seems to me if you have these strong views, it's difficult to be an independent, because you've got pretty strong views that would pretty predictably put you in the Republican camp.
Well,
Again, that too is good news for the Democrats.
There aren't. I'm sure you've done this. You go to rallies. And I've gone to Tea Party rallies, and one thing you do is, after you've talked to somebody for a while, you ask them who they voted for. In 08, and 04, and 2000, and 96, and almost all of them at Tea Party rallies will say they voted for the Republicans.
Right.
So I remember Karl Rove used to carry in his coat pocket a laminated chart of voting in the last several presidential elections and self-identification as Republican, Independent, Republican, Democrat, or Independent, and it showed, a shrinking number of true independents, that is, people who could actually vote one way or the other. And he believed, and I think he was correct, that most people who call themselves independents really do lean strongly one way or the other. So I think we had the situation in 2008 where people were just disgusted with Republicans. They were extremely tired of Bush, and they gave Democrats a huge chance, and they're going to take some of it back come November.
And the big question is how much? I mean, do you think someday we will look back on Rand Paul and say he was the George McGovern figure of the Tea Party movement? That we're seeing the mirror image of the McGovernite wing of the Democratic Party in the early 70s in the Tea Party?
You mean like the very top moment of self-destructive, walled-off liberalism, right, or in this case, Tea Partyism? Right. Will there be a struggle within the Republican Party to regain
of course, Republicans don't like to talk about the center, but to regain the Republican center in any case at the expense of these radical Tea Partiers?
I think, first of all, I don't think a Senate seat from Kentucky rises to the level of a presidential candidate. So no, I'm going to reject the George McGovern idea. As far as the Republican,
we're still waiting for the Tea Partier's George McGovern. He has yet to show his face.
Well, maybe 2012. You never can tell. The key for Republicans is Democrats screwing up. I mean, Democrats finally found a good presidential candidate in 2008, but the absolute key for them in 2006 and also in 2008 was public disgust and fatigue with the Republican Party. I mean, there's just no doubt about it.
Well, actually, in 2008, the key was the economic collapse, I think.
Well, it was, but if you think that McCain really had a chance, I mean, there was a post-debate period where he was doing okay, but post-convention period where he was doing okay, but I will say I still believe that the reason Democrats won so much in 06 and 08 was people were simply tired and in some cases disgusted with the behavior of Republicans. Republicans had ruled the House for 12 years, from 94 to 2006. Bush for 8 years, and boy, it was a tough, long, consequential 8 years. People weren't happy. So the most important thing for the fortunes of any political party is the other party screwing up. Mm-hmm. And obviously, Democrats are not going to say, well, we made a mistake by passing health care reform. But if it turns out to be a factor in a lot of House races and some Senate races this November, then it could turn out that it was at least a political mistake. So we don't know. But I do say...
What else is there? Because I tend to think that it's not going to be a major factor. So I'm wondering
what else the
Republicans have to run
on. Oh, well,
healthcare reform.
Well, certainly the Republican base has always been extremely concerned about federal spending, and if anybody is concerned about federal spending, they're worried about what's going on right now. There's no doubt about that. And if you're a Republican Party, it wouldn't be too hard to blame it on Obama, Pelosi, and Reid. So spending is a huge thing. The general expansion.
And you don't even need the health care issue to make an issue of that.
No, you don't. No, I mean, it was a huge issue in the Republican primaries in 2008, where people would tell you that it was time for a Republican who would veto a bill, because Bush just simply hadn't done it before Democrats took over, and that it was time for Republicans who could rein in spending, and that was their way of saying that Bush had spent too much money. So the
question is it possible for voters to be pissed off about the deficit and pissed off about unemployment at the same time?
I think that I think the best argument you can make on that score is that an unemployment rate in the 10% range creates a general level of unhappiness that makes that
That doesn't necessarily
tends to be-
translate into Keynesian economics. It's just we're getting screwed here. Whatever the government's doing, they're clearly doing something wrong.
No, look, a lot of people, if the public opinion polls show, a lot of people believe the stimulus has not done, has not succeeded. You could argue, as the administration does every day, that it has. But it is actually a fact that it has not succeeded as advertised, in the sense that the Obama administration said that if the stimulus were passed, the unemployment rate would be significantly lower than it actually is today. So you could be mad about both, yes.
Mm-hmm. I guess that's right. I mean, I think I asked the question obviously to point out that it was illogical, but the fact that it's illogical doesn't mean that it won't be the prevailing sentiment in the fall, and that could hurt. But my sense is that the Tea Party movement actually hurts rather than helps, because I think the Tea Party movement scares a lot of folks.
I think it probably helps. I think it helps Republican intensity. I think that it's kind of separate from the independent unhappiness with him, but it doesn't. I don't think it runs independents off. So my guess is that it probably helps in a general election scenario. Now, we have not mentioned the two scandals, mini scandals, or they're big scandals if you're the one who's involved. The one in Connecticut, where the Senate candidate Dick Blumenthal exaggerated his military record, and in Indiana, where Mark Souder, the Republican representative, has abruptly resigned.
Exaggerated his abstinence record.
You just can't make it up. Souder had done this video in which he and the staffer with whom he was having the affair talked about their record promoting abstinence. So some things you just can't make up.
You just can't make it. It's an instant YouTube classic.
So I don't think the Souder thing has any, other than changing one race. I don't think the Souder thing has any greater significance.
No.
And I think
one sort of interesting wrinkle is when I saw the video, I assumed that this was, some 22-year-old staffer. She's very youthful looking.
She is.
The woman he had the affair with, but she's actually she's middle-aged. She's like 45 or something, and a married woman.
And
which some could argue is a slightly makes it slightly less damaging. On the other hand, when you're running on family values and abstinence
no, it's pretty bad. I mean, the Clinton thing. Obviously in the Lewinsky case, if he had had an actual affair with a woman around his age, I think
he probably did that too.
Well, yeah, but we didn't find out about it.
Right.
Then I think it would have been less spectacular and less damning for him than to have had such brief dalliances with and this strange carrying on with a woman who had been an intern in the office just a year earlier. So the fact that Souder had an affair with an adult woman in his office, okay, we'll give him props for that. But this is pretty bad for a member of Congress to do.
It's pretty bad, and the I think just because the hypocrisy angle is so irresistible. But what I didn't quite understand was why there was it was assumed that there would be an instant ethics committee investigation into this. Does it actually violate ethical rules for a member of Congress to have an affair with a staff member? Souder kept saying. He kept referring to it as a mutual relationship, which is, I think, a new term in our political vocabulary. It means it wasn't sexual harassment. Of course, we haven't heard her say that. With a part-time member of my staff.
Part-time, just part-time. It's okay.
Just part-time. It was mutual. She was part-time. But seriously, if a member of Congress has an affair with a woman on his staff, and she's not a very young intern, and there are no allegations of sexual harassment. What do the House rules actually say about that?
I don't see that there would be. First of all, I don't know the House rules, so I should say I don't know the answer to the question.
Because Boehner clearly told him, "You're stick a fork in you, you're done."
Yeah.
But on what basis? Was that purely sort of politics? Was it based on actual rules?
And indeed, the first we heard of this was his resignation. At least first I heard of it was his resignation. But I don't know that there could be any ethical issues involved, and I can't name one, but I feel certain that members of Congress have married staffers and former staffers in the past. So I don't see what this is. To me, the bigger thing is just the hypocrisy thing and Boehner protecting the party's image, because it's not crazy that you had one member who did something like this. They just want to show that the Republicans pushed him out really fast. So now this other case I think is more interesting. The Blumenthal case is more interesting because it's kind of like a disease that was thought to have been conquered coming back. I mean, the issue of Vietnam used to be a pretty potent one. Vietnam service or non-service used to be a pretty potent one in presidential politics. There was a huge issue in the 1992 campaign. But you don't hear that much of it as much because I guess Blumenthal is probably close to 65 years old now. And here you have a guy who went around, and if Chris Shea's account, the Connecticut former representative account, is accurate, that Blumenthal has in recent years tended to exaggerate a bit more his service record. That early on in his career, he just kind of downplayed it, was self-deprecating about his service record, saying he was a desk jockey in Washington. And then in recent years, he occasionally slipped and said he had been in Vietnam. So it's an odd case.
No, he had a string. He just to explain, he had a string of deferments, Blumenthal. Quite a lot of deferments, like 5 or something, more than most people had. Mm-hmm. And then finally, when the jig was up, he got into the Marine Corps Reserve at a time when it was pretty clear, a time very unlike today, when if you go into the reserve, there's a pretty good chance you're going to be in Afghanistan or Iraq. But at the time of the Vietnam War, it was pretty clear it was very unlikely you were going to go to Vietnam if you were in the reserve. And in that sense, it was not quite as much of a draft dodge as going into the National Guard, but something of a draft dodge.
Yeah.
And I think what actually happened was, I think the taboo. I think you're right. This has been an issue for a long time, and it's diminished. But I think the fact that the issue is diminished is what tempted him to cross the line. I mean, if you go back to '88, people were ridiculing Dan Quayle for trying to pass off his time in the Indiana National Guard as actual military service, when lots of people who had been around at the time said, "Come on, this National Guard was a way to dodge the draft." Then in '92, you had Clinton's actively trying to get himself out of the draft by, I'm trying to remember. First, he was trying to enroll himself in the National Guard. He tried to get himself into the National Guard, but then when he drew a high draft lottery number, he basically double-crossed the guy who was helping getting him into the National Guard. So that was a scandal.
It was also an issue with Bush.
And then with Bush, yes, Bush was also in the National Guard. But by then, it was a little easier for Bush to at least halfway pass that off as Vietnam service.
Well, there were two issues with Bush, if I remember. One was the accusation that his daddy got him this plush spot in the Texas Air National Guard,
which is pretty indisputable,
and thus he didn't have to go to Vietnam. And the other was that he somehow skipped out on the service that he served for a little while and got bored and just skipped out on the end of it. So that
was also fairly indisputable. The only part that's indisputable is whether he ever got in or whether he was ever there was ever any danger that he was actually going to get in trouble for that.
Actually, I looked at his records very carefully, and I wrote a piece for National Review, which I would recommend people take a look at. He fulfilled his requirements every single year in the Air National Guard, flew an enormous amount in the first couple of years, clearly dropped off after that.
But he was gone for a big chunk of time when he was working.
Still fulfilled his requirements every year. But this was an issue in the 2004 campaign, obviously. John Kerry, Lieutenant Kerry, reporting for duty.
Right.
So,
and the fact that Bush won,
right.
Suggested that this was not
and Clinton won.
as potent an issue anymore.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite possible that Blumenthal sort of saw this and thought, well, now, you can say whatever you want. You can claim your service represents, your Vietnam era service represents anything you want it to.
That's an interesting theory.
And so the fact that he was in the reserve in the Vietnam era, he thought allowed him to call himself a Vietnam vet, and he allowed him to talk about when we returned from Vietnam. And he just got a little bit ahead of the zeitgeist, I think.
Well, I think he may have stepped in it in two ways. One was the accusation of just lying about it, and he called it a few misplaced words, which is kind of delicious. And the other is that he has run afoul of our current respect and reverence for military service, which has risen, I think, one in the sense of sort of post-Vietnam guilt about the hatred of the military, and two, the fact that we have these wars going on in Iraq and Afghanistan conducted by volunteer armies. They're done by people who put their lives on the line to serve the country, not because they were dragged into it, and we very rightly revere what they're doing.
Right, and it draws a very vivid and sharp,
exactly.
Painful line between those who risk their lives and those who don't, and it
right.
maybe renews respect for the significance of that line.
And so I think that when you're seen as having a few misplaced words, saying that you were actually in the war when in fact you were at home, I think that could be a very, very big problem on those two fronts, the honesty front and the military honor front.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that I don't know what the polls are showing, but I would think he would be in big trouble as a result of this.
Now, that's about all I have to say about today's politics. Anything else we need to cover on the political election/scandal front?
I can't think of anything. I would just when we were talking about sort of the Tea Party, how the Tea Party is being damaging
right.
to more damaging Republicans, I forgot to mention that they chased Charlie Crist out of the Republican Senate primary.
They did, but you have to remember that again, I mentioned earlier, Pat Toomey almost knocked Arlen Specter off in 2004. I mean, got really, really close in a pre-Tea Party world. And
mm-hmm.
my feeling is Marco Rubio would have launched a challenge against Crist in a non-Tea Party world. So I just think you can make too much of the Tea Parties. There is a very, very active group in the Republican base who there's a huge debate about rhinos, and some conservatives feel like you got to live with them, and others want to knock them off. And so I think that effort would have happened even if there were no Tea Parties. Other things going on now. Elena Kagan has sent her questionnaire, her filled out questionnaire to the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is available on the Senate Judiciary Committee's website. I would recommend.
I have not seen this. Is everything answered none of the above?
Every article she ever wrote for the Daily Princetonian, what began as a Xerox copy and now PDFs, is there on the Senate Judiciary website, and you can go look at them if you choose.
And also her senior thesis?
Her senior thesis is on because, there was this weird thing where this is the one on socialism in New York City, and there was a Red State, Eric Erickson's website, had gotten a copy of it, and we at the Washington Examiner also posted a copy of it. And
did you? I didn't know that.
And Erickson, I believe Erickson took it down because Princeton objected on copyright grounds. Now the White House in this.
Now, who owns the copyright? Surely she would.
I would think so too.
Well,
the White House has put it out, and it's available on the website.
Right.
So it's the availability of the thesis is no longer in question. You can get that.
And it's just to put some context, it's ridiculous because they make it available to the public if you can just sort of get down to Princeton and show up at Firestone Library, you may see it.
Whether or not the person approves or not, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So how is that any different from putting it on the internet?
Yeah, I don't know. My feeling is that it was just a knee-jerk reaction on Princeton's part. But anyway, it's there. So
now, did the Examiner get intimidated by Princeton into taking it down?
We didn't take it down. I don't know if they asked or not. But the time in which Princeton was trying to get it taken down and it got approved sort of by the White House for release was almost hours. So it was a brief controversy.
Yeah.
But anyway, lots of her other stuff, everything she's ever written and said that she can find, is out there. Hopefully, it won't be a situation like Mr. Liu in the Ninth Circuit, Goodwin Liu, who had to keep going back and adding to his materials over and over and over again. You would think the White House is prepared on this. I wrote a piece this week about an intense debate that's going on behind the scenes among Republicans in this effort, and that is whether to oppose and fight, try to stop Kagan because that's what Democrats would try to do in the same situation, or whether to concede that she's qualified and support her to support the view that the president deserves to have qualified nominees confirmed. It really came out in the open.
Is there fear among the Republicans that if they oppose her, that Obama will give up on the idea of trying to make his next, if there is a next Supreme Court nominee or next other major nominee, someone palatable to the Republicans?
No, I don't think that they think he's trying to do that. I mean, a lot of this.
They don't think that he regards Elena Kagan as the safe choice.
No, he does regard it as a safe choice, but he's not doing it to make Republicans happy. He's got 59 votes in the Senate right now, and if he manages to hold on to a majority next time, he'll nominate whoever he chooses then. I mean,
well, then what's the point of going with the safe choice if you've got the votes anyway?
Well, prior to his nominating Kagan, I had said it was time for him to go along if he wanted to. If he could find somebody to the left of Stevens, he could get him through because 59 votes you simply can. But he went with the safe choice. Why did he do that? I don't know why he did it. I mean, I think she's going to be a reliable liberal. But the debate really kind of came.
There were a lot of people who thought Wood was the better. I mean, the New York Times did a profile of her. It looked like she was Jesus Christ. It was you were sort of panting by the end of the piece to get her onto the court. But clearly he thought that she would have been too provocative a choice because of her positions on abortion.
Well, then he's thinking in terms of the midterm elections or something, because he's not thinking in terms of confirmability, because unless there's something we don't know about Wood, and we should always say that with a nomination, unless there's something we don't know, she'd get confirmed too, don't you think?
I don't know. I'm wondering how the politics of this
work. There are 59 Democrats.
All I know is that Kagan clearly was a very safe choice. She was the choice who looked to be most palatable to most palatable. Not that doesn't mean she's. Republicans are dying to put her on the court.
Well, the only way to stop her would be a filibuster, and there are 41 Republicans, all of whom, every single one of whom would have to hold together in a filibuster, and that is simply not possible, given that there are a number of Republicans who believe this idea that the president should get great deference in getting his qualified nominees confirmed. There's no way that all 41 of them would stay together. 8 Republicans voted for Sotomayor. 4 Democrats voted for Sam Alito. We're obviously in a much more partisan period in confirming. It's always been partisan, but it's gotten even more partisan, I guess what I'm saying, in confirming nominees. But there still is a small group of senators on both sides who are willing to grant that deference to the president. So there's simply no way that Republicans could stop a Kagan nomination or a Wood nomination, barring some sort of calamitous revelation that we don't know about.
And where are Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh on this right now? I know Beck was sounding off about the senior thesis on socialism and saying that shows that she's a socialist. Early on, is he still screaming and hollering about Kagan, or has he moved on to other topics?
I have to confess that I don't know what Beck's been saying about it. And actually, I've been a little out of it, and I don't know what either one is saying about it. I would assume that Limbaugh is advising Republicans, one, to take a very, very close look at her, and two, probably to oppose her. I mean, that's the debate that's going on among Republicans. And the Democratic treatment of Alito has become kind of a model for them, which is there were 45 Democrats in the Senate at the time. 41 of them voted against Alito. 4 of them voted for him. That 41 included Senator Obama, who famously also voted to filibuster Alito. So it's going to be a reasonably tight vote, and I guess it would be in the 60s to confirm her, again barring something we don't know about. So I'm not quite sure. When you raised the question about the safe choice, I don't totally know why he went the safe route, because he's never going to have a better opportunity, even though this is not that court-changing position. He's never going to have a better opportunity to get somebody as far left as he would like on the court.
Might be the personal connection. He knows Kagan pretty well, right?
Oh yes, and and everybody who knows her seems to speak well of her. Many people do. Miguel Estrada, who sat next to her in first year in Harvard Law School, and was treated rather badly by Democrats in the Senate when he was nominated for a seat on the Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, has written a letter to the Judiciary Committee supporting her nomination, while at the same time pointing out that she's a big-time liberal, but supporting her nomination for the very reasons I was talking about before. I have one question before we knock off. I have one question for you on health care. Mm-hmm. And that is, you may have a cake already, I don't know, but on May 21st, I believe we'll celebrate the 2-month anniversary of the passage of the health care bill. And from my point of view, we've had a number of things that were not great news about it, from the company write-downs to this idea that it would actually raise the taxes of some people who have who use a lot of health care services, to this idea. I think we saw it in the papers that some of the companies provided to Henry Waxman's committee, that they were actually they've been considering, if not considering, counting the costs of dumping employees into a public exchange if that turns out to be cheaper than keeping them insured.
Right. Now on that last point, I sort of scratched my head when I saw that, because of course there was nothing. I think was AT&T one of them? I'm trying to remember.
I don't know.
There was nothing in the law that before health care was passed that prevented AT&T from saying, you know what, we don't feel like providing health care coverage anymore.
Well, that's true, but if you have a vigorous exchange that's regulated by the government, that's kind of the heart of the new system that comes into effect after 2014, that would be their chance. So my question for you is, I never liked it, so I still don't. Are you still feel as optimistic and sanguine about the healthcare reform bill as passed as you did a couple of months ago?
Yes, and with with the caveat that there were always things about the healthcare bill that I had problems with, and I've all along been assuming that there would have to be successive legislation to tweak it. You don't pass anything this big that doesn't require a lot of fine tuning and reconsidering portions of it. I think that the tax on so-called Cadillac healthcare plans will probably never come to pass. I think it'll get canceled before it takes effect, and I actually think that's a good thing because I think it's a misconceived tax.
Well, wasn't that tax going to be responsible for 30 or 40% of the revenue for this?
It was going to be responsible for, I think by the time they had poked a lot of holes in it, it had been reduced to something like 20% of its original revenue.
But it was originally going to be more than that, right? More than 20%.
No, I mean there will have to be some alternative tax mechanism to put in its place.
Okay.
And I don't know what that'll be. But it's funny. I was looking at an old piece I wrote about a year ago. The other day, I just sort of happened upon it, and I looked, and I had written what is in retrospect a very embarrassing sentence when I was talking about all the revenue options. I said, well, one revenue option is you could increase the Medicare tax for people at high incomes, and I said, but there's no point even discussing that because there's no way you'll ever get the votes for that. And that did in fact end up in the bill.
Right.
So this has caused me to be less definite about what's actually politically possible in terms of revenue measures that you can get through the Congress these days.
Okay, so it makes you less concerned about your belief that the Cadillac plan will eventually go away, that they actually will be able to pass some sort of other tax increase to take its place?
Yes, I'm not worried. Yes, and I'm not worried in general about the cost. There was a widely misinterpreted CBO report last week that on first read, and the report was very poorly written. And at first glance, it looked like they were saying that almost all of the savings had actually been wiped out when you considered the actual cost of implementing.
Right, like $115 billion more is going to cost.
Bill. Yeah, and that turned out to be wrong. The 115, I think about 85 billion, something like that, of the 115 billion turned out to be money that was already built into the baseline. So it was really, you were only talking about a reduction in savings of about 25 to 30 billion. And yes, the savings are not what we thought they were, but they have not been wiped out. And I've said all along that the accomplishment here is that the health care bill pays for itself. That any thoughts that this is in itself going to be a way to reduce overall spending outside of the universe of health care was a bit of a fantasy. That these savings do exist on paper, but one way or another, I think there's a good chance that over the course of 10 years, a lot can happen in 10 years. And so if they can just hold the line at making healthcare pay for itself, I will consider that a victory. But as of today, healthcare is still a deficit reducer, at least on paper.
All right. Well, I just want to hear your thoughts on that, and I believe that's all I have to say on all the topics of the day.
All right. Well, this was a pleasure, as always.
Enjoyed it.
And I look forward to seeing how the Tea Party is doing in the fall. Maybe we'll come back and talk about that when that happens.
Okay, and we will see you later on the Internet. See you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.